Hello and welcome back to The Report. Drone warfare has been in the spotlight for some time now, but a report this week revealed the names and stories of victims whom the drones have killed. Flaminia Jambalvo has been following the story.
Bibi Maman, 67, civilian. Rashid Raouf, 27, Al-Qaeda member. Tariq Aziz, 16, civilian. These are some of the names and stories of people killed by drone strikes in North Pakistan. The Naming the Dead project, an initiative launched by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, has recorded the names and stories of over 800 people killed by CIA drone strikes in northern Pakistan.
What is often reported about the people who are killed is that they are suspected militants or alleged militants, or they're alleged members of one armed group or another. And we felt that by collecting their names and as much biographical details as possible, you can start to analyse these claims that are, okay, are they militants? And if they are a member of an armed group, what threat do they pose to the United States? How legitimate was it for them to be killed in a drone strike? Are they extremely bad, highly wanted global terrorists, or are they just disenfranchised local young men who have joined up with one armed group or another? But there's also another point to Naming the Dead, which is irrespective of whether or not these people are innocent civilians or members of an armed group wishing ill on other people or perpetrators of atrocities around the world, they're still people. And recording their names, identifying them as casualties in this armed conflict that's been going on for 10 years, more than 10 years, we felt was a sort of a fundamental moral right for them as casualties in a war.
Over the past 9 years, the tribal region of Pakistan's northwest has been hit by hundreds of drone attacks as the CIA has sought to stamp out Al-Qaeda fighters and the militant groups that have given them shelter. Missiles launched from these high-tech, unmanned aircraft have hit homes, cars, schools, shops, and gatherings. Nearly 2,500 people have been killed, according to data already collected by the Bureau as part of their wider covert drone war research. Of these, 322 were civilians, 99 of which children, while 2/3 remain unidentified. Senior U.S. officials have described drones as highly precise weapons that target and kill enemies of the U.S. John Brennan, who oversaw the development of the drone campaign and is now director of the CIA, has said drone technology is an essential tool for its surgical precision, the ability with laser-like focus to eliminate the cancerous tumor called an Al-Qaeda militant, while limiting damage to the tissue around it. Much of the controversy around drone technology stems precisely from the lack of information provided by official sources, which has thus far made it difficult to assess how much safer are drones exactly making us. Flaminia Jambalvo, Islam Channel.
Well, Andrew Noakes from Labour Campaign for Human Rights is still with us in the studio to discuss this story. Let me begin with Yemen, not Pakistan. We'll come on to Pakistan, Yemen. I mean, just because somebody's a member of an armed group, the US isn't at war in Yemen. Does it have the right to kill somebody just because they're a member of an armed group?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Jonathan. When we look at the streets of Britain, we can be quite clear that there's no war going on. It's a peaceful place. When we look at somewhere like Afghanistan or Iraq, we can see that it's a conflict zone. But when we look at somewhere like Yemen, it's less clear. So it's kind of somewhere in between. Some days, in some parts of the country, there's what you might describe as a conflict. In other parts of the country, it's entirely peaceful. And at some periods, it's much more peaceful than at others. So when do we decide that a conflict is taking place, and therefore countries do have the right to engage in acts of armed conflict, which includes attacking people? And when do they not? When should they actually say to suspected terrorists, this is the evidence against you, we're going to take you to court? And I think when you have situations like in Yemen, and indeed in Pakistan, where it's really unclear whether there's an armed conflict taking place, I think the US needs to be a lot more careful about how it's deploying these weapons.
Well, do international lawyers have any impact on this? I mean, does the US listen to some of the critics from the international law community?
I think the US does listen to those critics, and I will say that even amongst lawyers, there's a lot of uncertainty and debate about whether somewhere like Pakistan or Yemen can be classified as a war zone, and what particular human rights or humanitarian legal instruments apply. But I think for the US, what's probably more important and relevant is how effective are these strikes? And I think at the end of the report, the question posed was, are they making us safer? And when we look at the tremendous anger and resentment they're causing in places like Pakistan, Yemen, even Somalia, and really being used as a recruiting tool for militant groups there, I think the answer is pretty clear that no, they're not particularly making us safer. And I know that this is something the US is very concerned about.
Well, it's also an issue of the relationship between the US and Pakistan. I mean, the Pakistani government, perhaps they're being completely duplicitous, but they are pretty angry, aren't they, with the US for using these drone strikes inside Pakistan?
I think they are being duplicitous. I think there are certainly sections of the Pakistani government that are all in favor of drone strikes. And right now, the US is launching drone attacks in Pakistan in support of a Pakistani military offensive. So they're working in concert. So I wouldn't be fooled too much by that. I also think there are elements of the Pakistani government, and certainly the Pakistani population, who are very angry about drone strikes and see it as a violation of their sovereignty.
And what about the argument that, I mean, this is really asymmetric warfare of the most extreme kind. There's no danger to any of the US drone operators, so they have no risk. The fact that they take no risk, does that make it much easier for them to use these drones? And so actually they're becoming whatever the equivalent of trigger happy is when you're talking about drones?
I think there's a danger of that, yeah. I think there is. But I think it's important to say that I don't think there's a problem with drones per se. I don't think there's a problem with the technology. I think the problem is how is it being used? I think it's perfectly legitimate for the UK government and the US government to have used drones in places like Afghanistan, where they are fighting militants there. And some say, it's an unfair advantage because no one from the UK side or the US side is at risk. But I think that's just the reality of war. Sometimes states do have advantages over others, or certainly over non-state actors. Non-state actors also have advantages. So I would just caution any view that it's the technology itself that's at fault. I think what's more important is how is it being deployed, what are the criteria for using it, and where is it being used?
Although I believe when we say risk-free for the drone operators, there is some evidence, isn't there, that even they can suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, because they see the graphic images on their screens of, if something goes wrong, suddenly they see that women were there and children. They also can have flashbacks, nightmares, breakdowns, and in the way that Vietnam vets and Iraq vets and Afghan vets have been having.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it just shows that it's not a video game. There are critics out there who say of drones that it's just like a US pilot turning on an Xbox console and shooting at the screen, but that's not what's happening. I think the evidence shows, as you say, that they know that they are actually taking people's lives, and that does weigh on them. And I would just say one thing, that over the last couple of years, the number of drone strikes in Pakistan has decreased dramatically, and the number of civilian casualties has also decreased. And I think the report was maybe a touch misleading, because it seemed to suggest that this is something that's going on a lot now. But actually, the first half of this year, there were no drone strikes in Pakistan at all. And I think that's a recognition of the fact that there is actually some blowback, a backlash against the way drones are being used.
Now, this report, which we're talking about, is put out by the Bureau for Investigative Journalism. But in a sense, shouldn't it be the MOD, or in the case of the US, the Pentagon, that is coming up with statistics. Why should it be left to a civic organisation, non-governmental, to do the research? I mean, shouldn't we know officially, if we want accountability, how many people are being killed by British drones or American drones in Pakistan, and how many civilians were killed by accident in the same strikes?
Well, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism is doing some great work compiling these statistics, but you're absolutely right that the US government and the UK government need to be a lot more transparent in providing that data about drone strikes. It's even unclear in Afghanistan which country has conducted a particular drone strike. So is it the UK or is it the US? And when you get that kind of situation, there's no way of enforcing accountability.
And also there's the whole question of how do they really identify the victims? I mean, they say that so-and-so is a member of an armed group. Well, a lot of these armed groups are not wearing uniforms. Maybe does that mean that they were actually carrying a gun at the moment that they were shot? I mean, if they were, you know, in a camp with people but not actually carrying a gun, maybe they're just some kind of civilian helpers. They're not actually members of an armed group. So, of course, the Pentagon wants to pretend or say that more and more of the people they're killing are military or terrorists or whatever. But can we be sure of their identification?
No, we can't be sure all the time. But I think drones are a lot more precise than other methods of carrying out strikes. So when you're in a manned aircraft, you can't loiter over a target for 24 hours, but you can if you're using a drone. So you can have a much clearer idea of who you're hitting. A lot of the civilian casualties that have taken place because of the loose targeting criteria that the US did once have. So the US used to perform things like signature strikes, which means if you're in a certain part of Pakistan and you're carrying a rifle and you're traveling in a convoy of vehicles, you must be a terrorist. And so people are killed on that basis. Now, obviously, that's completely the wrong approach, because there could be all sorts of reasons why people are carrying a gun. In fact, in parts of Pakistan, it's entirely customary that men should carry guns, even if they've got nothing to do with the Taliban. So mistakes were definitely made. I also think the way the US used to target civilian areas in order to take out suspected terrorists who were living among civilians caused a lot of the controversy. Originally, there was a case back when Bush was president of a madrasa being bombed, and I think it was about 69, 70 school children were killed in that attack, and the terrorist who they wanted to kill actually escaped just before the attack. And that's the kind of thing that I think really creates so much anger. But in the last couple of years, those kinds of tactics have lessened, again, because I think
we're going to have to come to the end. Thank you very much indeed, Andrew Noakes. That's all we have time for on tonight's programme. So I want to thank you for watching. And remember, you can keep up with our Twitter conversation on all of tonight's stories by tweeting @IslamChannel and using the hashtag #TheReport. We're back tomorrow evening at the same time. For now, we'll leave you with some scenes from Pakistan, where more than 2,000 school children took to the streets of Karachi to protest against Israel's offensive in the Gaza Strip. They demanded an end to the violence. And we'll be back tomorrow. But until then, good night.